Hello, my name is Jonathan Hyam, and I'm the curator of music and recorded sound here at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, located at Lincoln Center. Welcome to Remote Links, a series of videos exploring the life and legacy of composer and artist Maryanne Amacher. The New York Public Library is proud to be home to Maryanne's archive, where it will be available to the public for years to come, free and open access. I'd like to introduce you today to Remote Links as a series that will be hosted by Bill Dietz and Amy Cimini, editors of Maryanne Amacher's selected writings and interviews. I'm thankful to Bill and Amy, Blank Forms, the publisher, as well as the Cervalvis Foundation, whom we partnered with on this series. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Remote Links. Today's guest is Sumanth Gopinath. Sumanth Gopinath is Associate Professor of Music Theory in the School of Music at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. His research interests include Steve Reich, musical minimalism, sound studies, new media, and US American experimental and popular musics of the 20th and 21st centuries. He's the author of the Ringtone Dialectic that came out in 2013 from MIT Press and co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Mobile Music Studios in 2014. He did that along with Jason Stanyek, and also is the co-editor of Rethinking Reich from Oxford University Press in 2019. That was co-edited with Siôn. He is the leader of the independent Americana band, The Gated Community.
Thank you, Bill. I met Sumanth probably 15 years ago amid one of my first brushes with academic music studies as then a graduate student in the mid-2000s. As a scholar and a friend, Sumanth quickly became a model for voracious, wide-ranging intellectual projects, careful critical engagement, and sharp political analysis. I've been grateful to engage and teach his work on Anglo-American music theory in the Neoliberal University, on a racial unconscious in Steve Reich's tape music, and his book, The Ringtone Dialectic, a project that he funnily calls perverse and eccentric in the book's opening sentences, and that asks how, quote, the micro-industrial economy and a novel cultural form both mimicked and shaped much of the world writ large. After reading the book recently, a student said frankly to me, I want to think this way, echoing a sentiment I have long felt myself. Over the last 6 years, especially, conversations with Sumanth about my own research on Amacher have been revelatory. His questions wove together aesthetic, technological, social, embodied, and political economic registers of analysis that provoked for me new interpretations and material grounding for thinking about her work and practice. And so for Remote Links, I jumped at the chance to hear Sumanth reflect further on Amacher in her own words.
Thank you both for that kind introduction. Thank you, Amy. That's very moving to hear. And I will be reading a short piece. It's called Hearing the Space Day by Day Live from the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And then I'll be just reading a short commentary I wrote on it, and then we can proceed from there. Hearing the Space Day by Day Live, September 28th to November 3rd, 1974. Normal Museum Hours. An installation prepared for the Walker Art Center Auditorium, Minneapolis, Minnesota. 2 or more outdoor sounding environments in Minneapolis are being transmitted directly to the auditorium space in real time, as occurring. The installation links spaces distant from each other, together in time. At each of these sites, a microphone is installed on the ledge of a partially open window. 15 kilocycles per second Northwestern Bell channels transmit the sounding spaces to the auditorium. Sounding environments were selected for dimension and perspective present in live auditory spaces, where distant and local sound is clearly present in the environment. Because of normal associations of seeing and hearing, continuous transmission provides a perceptual detachment not readily possible when physically at the site. A place memory is seeing in. Ambience and time becoming image. Perceiving orally as image. Sound is experienced here more as appearance into the space, rather, than as continuous, non-stop audible flow within the space. Hearing the space, what is distant and what is local, clearly and simultaneously, hearing over time, an approach and disappearance of what is sounding in the environment. Vibration in air heard minutes before the actual sound of the train is heard. Changes in air vibration as different phenomena approach the site. Birds sensing these changes in air, their anticipation, announcement of arrivals and disappearances before the sound of the change is heard at the site. Hearing the synchronicity, live, as it is, patterns within air. Reading this passage makes me think two things. First, I wonder why Amacher wanted to hear the city, my city, Minneapolis, in 1974, in its simultaneity, to experience time out of time, to be omniscient in this way, to create urban pastorals. This is partly explained in her interview on page 143 of Selected Writings and Interviews, when she talks about the limits of, quote, our physical experience, unquote, and taking, quote, little steps along the way to this day when we'll actually be in our world out of a one-place situation, end quote. The ambition for a global music that she mentions suggests that this impulse is anti-nationalist, or at least anti-regionalist. But the impulse is also Cajun and, moreover, and very importantly, abstract. As she says, this sort of simultaneous listening communicates an idea, which is apparently a more original thing to do as an artist. In relation to this, the second thing that this project makes me think about is what happened to Minneapolis and to me during the uprising that followed George Floyd's murder by police in late May 2020. Because of the pandemic and health problems in my household, we could only participate in the protests in a limited fashion, observing in solidarity from a distance, a fact of which causes a bit of guilt. And largely, my partner Beth Harmon and I were stuck experiencing these protests and the violent reactions to them, as did so many people via live stream media, especially Unicorn Riot. But with a difference. We were only 2 blocks away from the upheavals, and so, as sources of sound, we heard them often in 2 ways, through the air and windows, and via the internet onto computer speakers. The lag time of the latter meant that when we heard a loud sound, which we learned to identify much in the way that Martin Daughtry describes in Listening to War, this is a rubber bullet, this is, live bullet, this is a tear gas canister, these are fireworks, etc. We heard it first via the windows and then via computer speakers. Having this sort of omniscience was horrifying, fascinating, and practically useful. On May 27th through 29th, we could track where fires began, which afforded information as to how dangerous the situation was for us, and if we and our neighbors needed to flee, which it turned out we did not, though we came close on the 27th. In contrast, no cameras were covering the gunfire on our block. I still have no idea who was shooting guns here all night on May 28th and why. This listening was, however, not a moment to appreciate in the detached fashion that Amacher seems to facilitate. It was stressful and gave us an up-close view of a city being rent apart and from which it will not recover until there is a wholesale transformation of how security and policing work in the city, especially for people of color and especially Black Minneapolitans. Next Monday, March 8th, is the start of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the cop primarily responsible for murdering Floyd, and I certainly fear chaos, mostly due to police overreaction, next week and in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, relevant spaces in Minneapolis and St. Paul have been boarded up and look like green zones. I like thinking of Amacher as not only providing us a means of omniscient, simultaneous listening for the purposes of aesthetic contemplation, but also practical value, knowledge that contributes to safety and well-being, both for residents and for protesters. It's surely not what she had in mind, but it's on what's on my mind right now.
Thank you so much. This is, yeah, I'm still processing, but I mean, it's great. Your comments are fantastic. I mean, I think they do exactly what we hoped what Amy and I had hoped this series would do, which is in bringing in sort of new readers to sort of open up new ways of thinking about her work. One thing I hope, well, there's so many things, but one thing that comes to my mind, which is like partially a question for both you and Amy. I'm thinking about the function of the Walker Art Museum in relation to Minneapolis and its own history and what its development, I believe it started in the 60s or 70s, if I'm not right, like sort of what that meant in terms of the urban development of the city and what kind of implications that may have also had. And I'm thinking of that in particular because Amy has written really wonderfully about the relationship between urban development and remote listening and some of the other city links pieces of Amacher. So I wonder if that's maybe an interesting way to think about your kind of first point about why the Walker. And I mean, of course, the mundane, prosaic answer is she was invited by the Walker, and like Cage had a relationship to the Walker, and so she was invited, and blah, blah, blah. And that's maybe less interesting, but I guess it's sort of more interesting to think about what the Walker meant at that moment or something.
Yeah, this is a great question. I can't claim to have a profound knowledge of the Walker and its history, but I do have a kind of entry point into it, and thinking about the history of musical minimalism, which is adjacent to or tangential to Amacher's own history and experience, and the sort of post-Cagean sorts of developments in experimental music in the U.S. So let me just say that the Walker is situated in a particularly, sort of liminal space in the city. It's at the edge of the Uptown neighborhood, made famous by Prince's song Uptown, and was a kind of, significant site for, I would say, the kind of, the gentrification of Minneapolis. I mean, it was a sort of site of, at one point, a lot of clubs and restaurants, and it increasingly became a sort of space for, upwardly mobile young people. Over a period that I think is a long process that I don't fully understand. It was not in that way at the time when Amacher was here, and that would change. I remember a colleague, Richard Leppert, who owns a house there. He spoke about buying a house for an incredibly cheap amount of money, and it was run down. There were these old Victorian homes, and putting a lot of work and time into it. And I think the transformation of property values there has probably multiplied by amounts like 5 to 10 or more times. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. It's nothing on the scale of the kind of gentrification you see, on the most expensive cities on the coasts, but it's striking for Minneapolis. And then to the other side of the city is downtown Minneapolis, and so Uptown is sort of southwest of downtown, which is kind of interesting, and that is then adjacent to the warehouse district, a former, kind of, industrial zone of the city that has then become, also in the last really 20 years, another major site for urban development and And in the past, also a kind of space for urban renewal projects in the 60s. My partner, Beth Hartman, actually writes about this. But most recently, as the sort of so-called North Loop district became, sort of shaped as a residential zone with condos and, and kind of amenities servicing the residents that were intended to kind of move there, that area has changed a lot too. So the Walker is a part of the urban amenities of that, sort of important corridor of the city. And I guess thinking about, what Amacher would have seen at the time is different from what we would see now, I don't know if her work was sort of, I mean, I think one could say that the Walker contributes to or facilitates, a part of that gentrification story. I mean, I think that's probably true. And it's not just the Walker, it's also the large sculpture garden that is adjacent to it. And so there's a lot of land on the grounds there. And then there's an important other facet of this, which is the highway that cuts through there. And I don't know the date of when that was put in. One has to guess it would probably be also, sometime between the 60s and 70s, maybe earlier. But that also separates off the Walker from other parts of the city because Lyndale Avenue then kind of basically enters into the highway, and so there's this kind of way in which it's cut off from the downtown area. Although one through bridges and whatnot, one can get there by foot. But it's it's always interesting to kind of look back at old maps and think about what happened before kind of the big highway projects started to kind of really cut up cities. Anyway, there's another part of the story that's really interesting though, and this is something I have done a little work on, and that's the Performing Arts Center, the Performing Arts Division or Department of the Walker. Was run at that time by Sue Weil, who was a really interesting person. And Amy might have heard me give this paper on this topic. I can't remember, but basically Sue, what she did is that she used the dead days of the adjacent, now it's totally escaping me what the theater is. There's a really well-known, anyway, I'm forgetting, but a well-known theater, that the Guthrie Theater, that's what it is. And the Guthrie Theater used to be adjacent to the Walker before it moved to that warehouse district later. And at that time, because they shared this, essentially sort of this space, Weil had access to the dark nights of the theater. And so what she did was that she used them to essentially put on rock concerts. And so she had this kind of, they were on Sundays, I think. And so using those days, she could get sort of acts that were coming in on weekends in, often to Chicago on a Saturday, and got like Led Zeppelin or, really big name groups, and used the proceeds from that to finance experimental music and theater and dance performances, which is really fascinating. I mean, at that time, Minneapolis actually didn't have many really good mid-size venues for popular music. There were the sort of stadium option that the Beatles had used when they came to Minneapolis or the area in, I think, the mid 60s. But this was prior to the development of what is now called First Avenue, and is kind of the premier sort of mid-size sort of rock pop venue. And so she really filled a niche and is an important part of the history of both popular music programming, and then thinking about the ways that sort of related to the political economy of financing experimental music and performance. So I don't know, those are some things I think about just in response to your question. But I'm no urban historian of Minneapolis, and there are plenty of people here who would know way more about it than I would.
Well, thank you so much for that, Sumanth. I don't think I have seen you give that talk, but I'm really grateful to hear the thumbnail synopsis that you just shared with us. I'll maybe just add a few bits and pieces here. I think that prior to installing the telematic pieces at the Walker. I think that Amacher had actually like quite a lot of time to do research and site visits, and her working notes suggest that she planned to incorporate like many more sites than ended up in the installation. I think she ran into some trouble with Midwest Bell doing the installation, etc. But you know, she had planned on using like a number of kind of post-industrial sites, which is common amongst the CityLinks projects in both Boston and Buffalo, you know, prior to before, which is also a really interesting, like it bears the imprint of kind of then maybe nascent urban redevelopment projects, because in a lot of cases she can access these sort of semi-abandoned sites precisely because like civic entities and commercial entities are kind of battling it out over who's going to develop, and then in the meantime like there's Amacher's microphone, right? So it captures a really interesting kind of layered historical interval here. And so in the Minneapolis case, that would be the grain elevators, which are at that time changing hands. I think from General Mills to actually like a chemical storage company.
Is it ADM, Archer Daniels Midland? Is that the one, or is that's what I think they?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But some of the other sites that she included were also like nearby nightclubs, like other riverfront, other lakefront sites. And also she planned to do a feed from Sue Wile's house, actually, to kind of fold her into like, you know, into the project, etc. So, I mean, one can imagine like a really complex, like socially layered conjunction of remote feeds in Amacher's planning stages, which I think are really suggestive and links up in a really cool way with the history that you just gave us. So that's just really, really wonderful.
Oh, that's very cool. I wanted to follow up on what you were saying and to think about in some ways, the second piece, which I think is a key piece of this, which is the racial politics of all of this. And, you know, we know that urban renewal and those highway projects we were talking about earlier separated North Minneapolis, which is largely Black, from the city. And so, I remember like, past Black Lives Matter protests when we would be walking across those bridges that, connected or divided really North Minneapolis from the rest of the city. It's striking. It's Minneapolis is a city known for its history of white supremacy, of racial housing covenants. There's actually a really informative project called Mapping Prejudice that a number of scholars, including Penny Peterson, who is another person that Beth has interacted with because of her work on brothels in the early 20th century in Minneapolis. And that kind of work basically shows the ways in which it's an extreme city in terms of its race politics. It's very sort of white immigrant, especially like Scandinavian and German immigrant dominated in terms of who has access to the levers of power, and that has translated or relates very directly to the sort of so-called achievement gaps and employment gaps that exist here. I mean, I don't know how the stats look now, but in the past few years, Minneapolis was shown to have the lowest rate of career advancement for people of color, or maybe it was for African Americans in particular. So it's something that I think marks the place, and I think also places, say someone like Prince's rise in stark relief in terms of the kind of trying to figure out what is the raciality of Minneapolis. I mean, it's complicated, and of course it's not a black-white story too. I mean, there's a large Native population here, and the American Indian movement was founded here, so that also shapes the dynamics in important ways. And of course, more recently, large refugee settler and or I should say large refugee and immigrant populations um, have come to the city who are, make its mix of populations distinct. So there's a very large Hmong community from Laos as a result of fleeing from the wars in Southeast Asia, and and obviously the U.S.'s primary role in all of that, and then a very large Somali and East African population. Um, and then there's also a very large Latinx population as well. So Minneapolis has sort of changed pretty profoundly in the years since the 70s, when it would have been a white, black, and indigenous city primarily. Um, in terms of thinking about this and Amacher's sort of urban pastorals and like the way that she was thinking about mapping and the kind of implicit subject of her work, and this is something maybe I can ask the both of you, because um, does she attend to race? Is that something she thinks about? My sense is her writing is very sort of, you know, like there's a lot of an objective kind of empirical imaginary into what she's doing. She's interested in kind of you know looking at the science of communications or of physical perception later on, and I'm wondering, um, yeah, if the racial politics of these projects and how they might relate, does that come up in our awareness? And you would know better than me. It's not something I saw when I was looking for it in the discussions, and obviously that's something that a kind of juxtaposition that I'm raising in the reference to the murder of George Floyd and the uprising, and so yeah, that's a question I have for you both that I'd be curious to hear more about.
Sure, it's something we've definitely thought a lot about. Actually, one of our the guests that we previously recorded with, Martina Roberts, we had a conversation like off camera about this. It's not something that comes up so explicitly. My thought, and having given this some consideration over the years, is a little bit, it's a different kind of answer, which would be to say that the kind of subject-based listening that she develops in this really specific practice, which in a certain sense is also almost psychedelic. It's so attentive to attention that objectivity is constantly undone.
Hmm.
In a certain sense, I would, this is, I don't know if this is far out or not, I would go so far as to say that this is a sort of, for lack of a better word, deconstruction of something like white listening and kind of classically trained listening that exactly in relation to your second point and what you were talking about too, this paradigm of like contemplative aesthetic appreciation or something like that. It's the approach that she developed like constantly undid that in a way that I find very useful in applying to other things. And I guess the one way that I would slightly inflect that more specifically is to say that that way of listening that she developed allowed her to appreciate other musics very differently. She was absolutely not interested in any kind of like stylistic distinction. And this form of listening, this sort of deconstructed, classical listening or something, allowed her to hear intelligence or to hear complexity in all kinds of musics. And so like for her then the question of collaborating with improvisers or with people who had a jazz background or people who had a rock background became like very easy. There was no problem or boundary at all. And it was able, like in a music-y way, to be worked out. It's not, as far as I know, like explicitly framed as such or talked through.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I remember in one of the interviews I was reading where she sort of talks a lot about the horse and like the sort of which is a topic that really fascinates me in general because I've been very interested in the semiotics of transit and I really was inspired by the work of Raymond Monell, who wrote a wonderful piece on the sort of horse and the sort of sound and topoi in basically 19th century art music. And so, seeing her kind of wanting to get away from the horse as a kind of figure for I don't know, like, white concert music, I think is definitely one way to sort of read it. There's another way too, which is like, to what extent is her imaginary a urological as opposed to an aphrological one, to take, George Lewis's, sort of perspective on this. And I don't know, that's maybe another way. I tend to be, maybe you've, sort of gotten this from my sense of the way I've approached Steve Reich's music and the minimalists, largely. I tend to have a critical, sort of view of it, in part because it is a world that's, very much a white world, and there were all sorts of, segregations and divides and imaginaries that, construct and shape how these, creators slash composers slash, artists, however they thought of themselves, tended to work in the world. So yeah, but you described the collaborations that Amacher did, which I don't know much about. So that also is a different thing, and different from, say, someone like Cage, who really, had so many issues with improvisation, and his relationship to Black music seemed like, more vexed. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just riffing here, but maybe, I don't know, Amy, is this any of this like raised stuff that you want to react to?
Oh, I think I actually just want to share a few things actually. Um, I resonate really strongly with Bill's characterization of a deconstruction of classical listening, of white listening, like
Hmm.
this, like this approach, like sort of absolutely will not brook like a composer, capital C, even though Amacher could write in that voice, like very fluidly, I think. And the 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 ease of collaboration is also something that I've seen come through like so many times in my research. I think one of the very first talks I gave when starting this research was in fall 2013 at Wesleyan, and sort of amidst the Q&A, Braxton stopped me and said, she was an incredible improviser, and like wanted to make sure that aspect and understanding of how she did things was part of my understanding of her work. And I go back to that moment like so often. I think another like kind of lever to open this up is some of the sort of fictive or dramatic worlds that come together in the Music for Sound Joined Rooms and mini sound series. Like one wants to ask, like, well, what kinds of futures are being imagined here? I know that we've talked a little bit about this over the years, Sumanth, and in the meantime, I've done like a little bit of a deeper dive on her with her engagement with some of the kind of like marquee name, like very masculinist science fiction characters like J.G. Ballard or Olaf Stapleton. And I actually see her making like really interesting interventions into those narratives when she recasts them in, for example, Intelligent Life or sort of Even Living Sound. I think there are really interesting ways to read the way she deploys those narratives that kind of cuts sharply across like their own racial politics. And I think there are really interesting ways to open that up in relationship to other futurisms, to Afrofuturisms, and as someone suggested, also Chicano futurisms, et cetera. So I think that's maybe one thread that would be that I don't know why I'm acting out the thread right now in my Zoom square, but those are some of the dynamics that I think are also in play here.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I mean, I had one more thought, which I know we're probably already going long, but just another thought about especially this. I think it's really important, this kind of call for or wanting to think her music as something practical versus this sort of abstract aesthetic contemplative tool, and inflect that in like a few tiny ways. Like one is just as the documents in this section of the book show, like it's a weird section because it's sort of unruly. There's like a lot of different things that happened around the walker, and like I honestly can't even claim to understand exactly what's what and what all was happening there. But one thing that's interesting is, thinking of the museum as this kind of colonial gentrifying apparatus, and also like when it's positioned, when it's established and opened, it also becomes like a, like a optical or oral device for looking out at the world. And so often, like a museum, a new museum in a new area of town will be also like a sort of, way for the art audience to experience something exotic or whatever like this. And there's one little part of the Minneapolis pieces that I think does something interesting with that, and that's the piece No More Miles, an acoustic twin. And in this one, what she does is, instead of making a remote link to a post-industrial place or somewhere like this, she tries to find all over Minneapolis a quote unquote acoustic twin to the gallery space that's there. And what that ends up being is I think a budget rent-a-car. And so she creates like this link then between this incredibly kind of mundane commercial space and the museum, which I think does something slightly different. Like in a 70s way, I think like that kind of gesture maybe is even readable as like a sort of institution critical kind of art gesture, which it doesn't, so I think that there's some resonance then with that suggestion of sort of orienting these tactics specifically. And then the other small inflection was just, I remember towards the end of her life, and it's captured in some of the other documents, I think the section called Rare and Unusual Atmospheres, where she's thinking a lot about virtual reality and different sort of representational technologies, and what the sort of interface of a way of looking or a way of listening does to the information it's transmitting. And I remember at one point, like I think maybe more conversationally, her giving the example of like in medicine, using sort of virtual reality to do medicine, and so like how important the form of representation becomes in achieving something. And so like thinking about, like I know it's a little bit of a refined kind of consideration, but I think it's not an unimportant one to think about like the medium of the representation of like an insurrectional moment, like the transmission of insurrection, and how that medium and how it's transmitted also can matter. I think, again, like maybe a slightly refined point, but maybe again, somewhere where it becomes relevant in a different way.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, I mean, it's clear that a lot of, I mean, I'm sure it's been said, but that, the labor that it took to establish these links at that time would have been so extreme, right? I mean, and now it, equivalent versions of it are so easy to facilitate. And so, like her kind of, like anticipating telemedicine or whatever is, really, which is now such a normal thing, right? I mean, so it's a central part of how medicine is done now, is really interesting. The budget rent-a-car link, I mean, just the fact of the name alone, like, raises all these like class politics questions, which I think are really interesting too. But yeah, the form of representation in insurrection is also a really, really generative one. I mean, I know that the role of live streaming news sources, and Unicorn Riot, Andrew Mercado, there were a few different people who were doing it at the time and continue to do this. And it really is a kind of form that's dependent both on the role of mobile phones, to kind of transmit and access information quickly, but also the role of sort of these activist journalists who are kind of intervening in these spaces and talking to people. I mean, this one particular one, Nico, I think, is sort of fearless in terms of just talking to anybody about why are you here, what are you up to, what do you think about this, and getting such a wide record of what's motivating people. I think that was so important in the coverage and why they got so much attention and then donations, and rightly so, I think, because no one else was really trying to represent what's motivating what's happening. I mean, there was a lot of scaremongering around white supremacists who did participate, and it's clear that, and it's hard to kind of sort out to what extent they were involved, but there were a lot of young people who were upset, and as a friend said, and inherited a crap world, right? And are basically trying to negotiate it. And so, I think, it behooves us to kind of just, listen and think about and understand, what happens, even if, the results, in some cases were terrible. I mean, two people died. One person died because of, they were both at pawn shops, interestingly. One person died at a pawn shop because the owner shot someone. And the other one, which is 2 blocks from here, someone got trapped while they were in there. And so they died when it was on fire. And yeah, these terrible things happened, right? But and we need to, acknowledge and be aware of that. But we also need to understand what was happening, and the assaults on communities of color that have been going for decades as a result of policing are horrific. And they, it's the back and forth that has kind of gone on in the city since then. It's really like raised these so many interesting questions about, the entrenched nature and the kind of almost like protection mafia that police departments seem to have, through their monopoly of the means of violence within cities, or partial monopoly, of course. We're a very armed country. But yeah, I don't know. Those are things that made me think also, like, about the form question too. With these, in particular, these, the live streaming form, which is, I know people have written about it. I mean, there's a lot of journalism about it now, print journalism, I guess I should say. But yeah, great comment. I don't know. I mean, this idea of, then maybe not the idea, but the more general sense of trying to kind of read, you know, the hermeneutic or political implications of the practice. It seems like something that is fruitful in, an emerging Amacher studies. Is it something that she's articulating for herself, or is it something that you see as a kind of political unconscious in her work?
It's so hard to know sometimes with her. Amy and I we did a talk at Mills a few weeks ago about her, and one thing that came up was she taught a course there this is also in the book. She taught a course there in the early 90s, and we included in this book her bibliography. And in part why that was so eye-opening and important for us is that her writing, her official writing, like her finished or published, or what she would have shared with someone else writing, is so polished and so wonderfully stylized. But it also is, in a certain sense, quite opaque, because there's no footnotes. She doesn't refer to anyone unless it's like someone like Stapleton or whatever that Amy was mentioning a moment ago. So we don't often know what's in the back of her mind. But then you see this bibliography, 1994. The bibliography has Donna Haraway, Jean Baudrillard, I don't know, science fiction writers, Susan McClary. So it seems that these things were actually there, but for whatever reason, she sort of chose not to foreground them in the way she sort of publicly articulated herself.
Hmm.
Yeah, the bibliography, and then also reading notes, suggest that she took like a blossoming feminist science and technology studies like very seriously. She has notes from start to finish on cyborgs, simians, and women. And I was reading the acknowledgments to another scholar of that generation, Bonnie Spanier's book called Impartial Science, and learned that they were very close while Amacher was at the Radcliffe Institute. And so, they were friends as like Spanier herself was kind of turning from laboratory-based work to doing oral histories with women scientists, and then sort of moving more thoroughly into like critiques of constructions of race and gender, like in the biological sciences. And so again, even though we don't see this citational paper trail, and a lot of this is coming through coming through friendship, right? Friendship as a like method of critique and knowledge production, etc. One can sort of trace out some of those genealogies, and when they kind of crystallize, it's really very striking, I think.
That's great. Wow. Thank you both.
Oh, thank you. This has been really wonderful. So,
any follow-up things that we want to talk about, or are we calling it a day?
I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. Maybe there'll be a chance in the future, I hope.
Sure. Yeah.
I think this has been an awesome episode. Thank you so much. I know I'm going to be like buzzing all day from our conversation. This has been so great.